It's a real pleasure for me to introduce to you Bryan Leyland. We're moving a little south from Australia now to New Zealand. I consider Bryan to be the Indiana Jones of New Zealand. I had the pleasure of having lunch with him at the Auckland Yacht Club in New Zealand last August. And he was on his way the next morning to India, where he was going to help the Indian government set up a tidal power plant. Bryan is an electrical and mechanical engineer who dedicates himself almost entirely to energy projects. And if you want to build a tidal plant or a hydro plant or a wind or solar plant, he'll help you do it as best he can, but he'll tell you what the upside and the downside are. I was particularly interested. He sailed his own sailboat from Auckland to Tahiti, and then he got aboard Marlon Brando's yacht, the Bounty, and sailed to the United States. So he's an exciting fellow, and I know he's going to give you a stimulating talk. Bryan?
Thank you very much for that kind introduction. I just have to add one thing to my voyage to America by Windpower. Windpower brought my daughter to America in 1995. She was on the design team for Team New Zealand that brought the America's Cup back to New Zealand. Pardon me, that one. Right, we're talking about wind, solar, and marine power. A $720 billion boondoggle. Right, it's all about renewable energy. Why renewable energy? Why this great love for renewable energy? Governments have been persuaded that it will solve lots of problems, earn them lots of votes, reduce the risk of man-made global warming, reduce emissions of carbon dioxide, fossil fuels, energy dependence, mitigate the problem of peak oil, and maybe it'll give us low-cost electricity, or so it is promised. It won't. It won't. And I'm going to explain why. So $720 billion. Where did I get this number from? Here's the figures. This chart here shows it. Add them all up. $720 billion. But that's not ignoring the subsidies, the transmission, the free backup, and lots of others. It's more than $1 trillion when you add it all up. Now, that's a lot of money, even by world standards. Makes Madoff look pretty tiny and Greece look quite small. This is the question of what we want to ask. Is it just a huge boondoggle, which for those who are not familiar, a project funded by the federal government that is of no real value to the community or the nation? I think it fits. So subsidies, this is what it's all about. It's not about anything but money. They tell us it'll be economic in about 10 years. I heard that, I think, even yesterday. They demand and get 20-plus year guarantees subsidies. Don't they have any confidence in what they're saying? So these tax breaks give the US investors their money back after 3 to 5 years. 30% investment, 70% borrowed. The 30% comes back after 3 to 5 years. You're in clover. Never mind the poor consumer. Spain pays 6 times the market price for solar power, and America's not much different. Guaranteed for 25 years, which is far longer than the solar panels will last. The total cost of Spain is supposed to be $41,335,000,000 per consumer per year. Now, $41 billion is a fair chunk of the amount that Spain's in debt and is at risk from. All they've done is put their country into a worse situation than it would otherwise be. So we've got to start, and I think as has been mentioned already, let's look at the world energy resources. Do we really desperately short of resources? Do we need this stuff? We'll talk about the characteristics of wind power, which is really very important, and the potential and prospects for solar, wave, tidal stream power, all the other new renewable energy technologies, most of which aren't new. And then I'm going to do an apples for apples comparison between isolated systems supplied by nuclear power, just as a reference, and by wind power. Because if you have them both supplying the same load, doing the same thing, then you've got a fair comparison. What people tend to do is slide a little bit of wind power into an existing system. It borrows transmission, it borrows backup, and it borrows that, and it appears to look cheap. But it's a more complicated story than that. So, energy resources available to mankind are greater than they have ever been in the past. I was at a conference a few years ago and some woman got up and said, of course, we've got much less resources available to us than the Victorians had 100 years ago. Nonsense. They didn't have oil for a start. They didn't have nuclear power. It's crazy. The thought's even crazy. So we've got enough coal for 130 years, gas for 60 years, and now in America, a few years ago you were desperately short of gas, and now you've got it running out of areas. And oil, 42 years. For how many years, and I'm 73, have I heard that the world's running out of oil because we've only got enough reserves for 30, 40, 50 years? Right? What people seem to forget is exploration will continue, more will be found, and then we've got huge resources in tar sands and undersea methane, this clathrate. People who are looking at technology to develop that, it's just about infinite, I think, isn't it? Enormous. Right, the technology is going to be difficult, but there's been lots of difficult technologies, and after all, some people did get to the moon. And then we've got nuclear energy. Well, uranium resources. People say, we've only got enough uranium for 50 years. Proven resources, 50 years. Now gone up to 80. On the expected resources, 250 years to supply. Use a breeder reactor, it's more than 1,000. And that's without even considering energy from thorium, which in my view is a far, far better way of running a nuclear power system. Thorium is 3 times as abundant as uranium, and the burn-up is much more efficient, which means generates more power and less waste. And 750 year supply is probably a crazy underestimate. Nuclear power could supply all the energy we need for more than 500 years. It's not a technical problem, it's a political one. So the conclusion on energy is the world has ample, sustainable resources. Alternatives will be found when peak oil comes. We can decide to use these resources, or we can decide not to. If we don't use these resources, world energy supplies will become expensive and unreliable. Poor people will suffer most. These are the people we are talking about. This is a photograph I took in 2007 when I was working in northwestern Zambia, helping a mission station get a hydro scheme going. These people already suffer from Rachel Carson and the ban on DDT. Malaria was endemic. I was terrified, literally, of getting malaria. These people are suffering also because well-meaning carbon haters have stopped that country building a coal-fired power station. It's criminal. Sorry, I'm getting upset. Literally. The problems with wind power. It's very expensive, $2,200 a kilowatt, and about 11 cents a kilowatt hour. For intermittent power, the capacity factor is low. Capacity factor is the output that the station would run at if it ran all the year at a steady output and generated the same amount of power. So it's roughly the third of the amount of power that a nuclear power station or a coal-fired power station would generate the same capacity. In other words, 1,000 megawatts of wind power will generate this much. 1,000 megawatts of nuclear power will generate 3 times as much. It's unpredictable. The output, no more than 5% to 10%, we relied on when it is needed. Yesterday we had somebody saying in California, in the middle of the summer when it's stinking hot and all the air conditioners are running, the wind isn't blowing. Well, what use is that? It's seasonal, and it needs support from fossil fuel stations. So it's free riding all the time on fossil fuel stations. So we mentioned the fluctuations. This is an actual plot, half-hourly outputs from a 184 megawatt wind farm in New Zealand. This is what the system operator is up against. Now, New Zealand has some of the best wind power in the world. Capacity factor is 37%. So this is really good wind power. And what do we see? Just here, it goes up from nearly nothing. You can barely see that little thin line there. That's a half-hour line. Went up and down within half an hour. You're the system operator. You don't know what's going to happen next. So what have you got to do? You've got to have stations on standby, ready to pick it up, or idling, using fuel, generating nothing if the wind suddenly blows. Then what you see here is a big problem for New Zealand, as in California. Here's our critical dry period in the autumn when it isn't raining. Our hydro lakes are low and the wind doesn't blow, and we get quite long calm periods of several days or several hours. Not much more than several hours, almost a week sometimes of calm weather. The UK gets the same problem. This is serious. But what do we get here? This is the springtime. What's happening in the springtime in New Zealand? It's raining, the snow's melting, and the wind's blowing, and we've got more power than we can use. And the problem is, if you're going to use that, you have to store it to get it into there. And I'm going into that in detail. That is the major problem. Then we get into offshore wind power. You've all heard of Cape Cod. Well, Dear to Helm, I'm sure you know of him, do you? Yeah, the UK, very respected man and the economist in the power industry in the UK. And he believes in man-made global warming. The most cost-effective way of decarbonising would be switch from coal to natural gas generation. Goodness gracious me. Coal produces roughly 1 kilogram per kilowatt hour of carbon dioxide. Gas, roughly half a kilogram. Change from one to the other. You've halved your carbon footprint, starved a whole lot of plants, and kept the greenies happy. But switching from coal to gas, he said, would cost 7 to 10 billion pounds compared to 150 billion for onshore wind. For the same amount of carbon dioxide reduction by switching from coal to gas, doing it with wind is going to cost you 15 times as much. How crazy can we get? It's unbelievable that people are seriously considering this. And the UK hasn't got it on its own. The latest on Cape Wind, which I'm sure you've heard of, they have just sold half their power for 20.7 cents a kilowatt hour. They can buy power for 6 cents a kilowatt hour on the open market. The 15-year contract has a 3.5% per annum escalation clause. 15-year contract for offshore wind power. Nobody knows how long they'll last. All the offshore wind that's been built, one had to be completely dismantled because all the machines broke down. Another one's had its foundations fail. There's no guarantee it'll still be around in 15 years. Enormous cost. For what? So then we get on to the other peripheral ones, which are lovely, lovely source of research money, as we heard this morning. Oh, it's all been done before. Tidal mills are as old as the hills of someone in the UK several hundred years ago, and that's all these things are. But this is the only one that I know of that has done 1,000 hours of commercial operation. I don't know how many millions have gone into developing these things all over the world. There'll be 20 or 30 of all different ones. They've got fundamental problems. You get a little bit of power out of a lot of water. It's tidal, so it's going that way, and it's going that way. And the spring tide, it goes like that. And a neap tide, it goes like that. And you don't generate much power. All right, you can predict when it is, but it's not when you want it. And you've got this terrible problem of neap tides. I know this because I worked on a tidal power scheme in northwestern Australia. And it was neap tides that killed us. And we tried very hard because it was an isolated system. But this, which has done 1,000 hours, is further ahead than anybody else, and it's got to be expensive because it weighs 1,000 tonnes. You've got 1,000 tonnes of machinery generating 1,200 kilowatts. It's money, and you can't get away from that. And it's already been mentioned, this project in India that I'm working on. It's in the Gulf of Kambat, which is just north of Mumbai, Bombay. Ahmedabad's up here, which is where I go. Very interesting, very imaginative project because it's associated with water storage. It has got potentially a huge benefit for the state of Gujarat, which has got no natural water storage. But the original concept was for a tidal basin here, freshwater storage here, and 5,800 megawatt tidal power station. The biggest tidal power station in the world in operation is in Lorence, France, 1960s, 240 megawatts. It's enormous. And last year, we looked at the economics, we looked at the power price in India, which is high, we looked at the problems of integrating 5,800 megawatts of tidally related power into the Indian system, and canned it. The tidal range is 10 metres. If anywhere there was a good site for tidal power, this is it. We couldn't make it work. We tried. Then we've got wave power. Now, new energy technology, hang on. This is the 1980s. The Norwegians done it. Professor Pelamis, as you'll see, and it's all been done before. Oscillating water column, technically brilliant. I know the people who designed it. I know the effort they put into making sure it would survive storms. It broke and they fixed it, and in the end, it was destroyed in an even bigger storm and they abandoned the project. This is in 1985. We've been there before. Someone was talking about one a little while ago, and they weren't as advanced as Norwegians were 20 years before. Then we've got Pelamis, the sea snake, developed by my friend Professor Pelamis. They brought it up again. It's been put off the coast of Portugal. Project abandoned for technical and financial reasons. We couldn't make it reliable, and it was bloody expensive. Then we get to the really interesting ones, which is solar. Germany's got solar power, huge amounts of solar power. Who's been to Germany and seen the sunshine regularly? Not me. It's mad. It's absolutely mad. And Spain's a bit better. I mean, the sun does tend to shine in Spain. Even so, 60 cents a kilowatt hour for power that goes off every night and every time a cloud goes over the sun. Subsidy 6 times the market price, guaranteed for 25 years. How long will it last? Less than that. And the latest, they put in, maybe not these people, they had a lovely idea for making more money. They put in a diesel generator around the back, and they ran the diesel generator to boost the output. And I think one night someone forgot to turn it off. And next morning somebody said, "Why were you generating power in the middle of the night?" And they were caught out. Oh, that's fraud. Anyway, let's come to the Achilles heel of renewable energy, which is energy storage. Large-scale wind, wave and marine power, they can't exist without long-term, low-cost, efficient energy storage. When I was here last year, Greenpeace came out with a renewable, some great energy scenario for America, 100% renewable. Oh, fantastic plans, solar power from here, wind power from there, transmission lines going everywhere, and it was going to be terribly cheap. Not a word about energy storage. So we've got to store the energy when the wind is blowing. It can be used when it's needed. No such technology exists, and it's not even on the horizon. They talk about, oh, well, we'll plug in all the electric cars and we'll borrow power off them. Well, that's only one night. You've just bought an electric car. It's got $20,000 worth of battery with a cycle life of 2,000 cycles. Let's say that's typical. So every time you charge or discharge the battery, it costs you $10. So you plug it into the mains, the wind doesn't blow, they drain your battery, and it costs you $10 because you've taken life out of your battery. And not only that, you switch the car on and it says, sorry, Fred, the wind didn't blow last night and I wasn't able to recharge your battery. I hope you can get a taxi. Oh, and they talk about this as serious. But there is one technology which is used widely for short-term storage, which is pumped storage. Here's a typical pumped storage scheme. It happens to be in Ireland. Upper pond, lower pond, power station underground. You generate power by shifting water from here to here in the peaks, and you pump it back when the wind's blowing or in the early hours of the morning when you've got surplus power. Good idea, standard, and most power systems have them. Anyway, here's a cost comparison based on a notional 10,000 megawatt isolated system, because then you can separate it out. But it's actually very relevant to existing system. Existing system can take about 10% wind power. When you go over that, you're actually into the situation I'm going to be describing, when the existing system can no longer support it. So it's quite realistic and very relevant. So we calculated the cost and did quite a lot of sums. So this is where we get to. This is the wind power scenario. Now, some of the figures that came out of here, I didn't believe. I had to check my spreadsheet. We've got a load of 10,000 megawatts, which is about 1.5 times New Zealand, probably some of the states in America are about the same, 55,000 gigawatt hours, which is a factor of about 60%, which is typical for most. And we've got, believe it or not, 31,000 megawatts of wind power are needed to generate the energy that the system needs. And then we've got to have pumped storage, which will store the power for 3 to 6 months. But for the seasonal problem, we've got 20,000 megawatts of pumped storage, probably $2,000 a kilowatt, if indeed you could find a place to build it, which you can't. But let's ignore that. We've got to do our best. $30 billion worth of transmission, because the line's going everywhere. Cost, installed capacity, 51,000 megawatts, 5 times the demand. Total cost of 138 billion, 13,000 per megawatt of load, and roughly 30 cents a kilowatt hour. That's a realistic cost of running a system 100% on wind power, if you could find the storage. And 31,000 megawatts of wind turbines will be in a line 400 miles long. This is only 31,000 megawatts. This is only to provide 10,000 megawatts of electricity. What's the American load? 150,000 megawatts? 200,000? Peanuts. So look at the option for nuclear. Getting the same sums. This time we have daily pump storage, which is what you saw, practical 6-hour storage, we can do the job. 8,400 megawatts of nuclear to provide 10,000 megawatts of load because it's running continuously and it provides the energy we need. 3,500 megawatts of pumped storage, got a bit of reserve capacity, and the whole thing works. Installed capacity is 1.2 times the load, which is pretty normal for any power system. Cost is $50 billion, $5,000 per megawatt of load, 9.2 cents a kilowatt hour. And guess what? It doesn't produce any carbon dioxide either. Everything you dreamed of for a fraction of the price. So, we come to the key question. Is renewable energy a boondoggle? I think clearly yes. Expensive, intermittent, 3 times the cost of something like nuclear, 4 times probably the cost of coal. The world isn't short of resources, and it needs long-term low-cost storage, which does not exist, or expensive backup from thermal stations, which destroys the whole 100% renewable idea anyway. So the only conclusion is that if man-made global warming was real and dangerous, it wouldn't make a measurable difference. That's because if you run it in a real system, you're going to have thermal backup, and when you calculate that, the wind power isn't all that green after all. In fact, it's an ineffective and expensive solution for a problem that we all know, in all probability, doesn't even exist. Thank you very much.